Jade City by Fonda Lee is a book I have been wanting to read for quite some time. Part of a series that has been kind of shimmering in the outer layers of the channel here in recommendations for a while now. And I'm very happy to say I finished it and it is well worth the ride. Recently I did a live stream here on the channel where I really complained about how many fantasy books just are copy prints. They feel such the same in terms of their setting. And I was in the middle of reading The Fifth Sorceress, which if you just watch my review on that, you know how I feel about that. Book? I feel like that's generous to call it a book. But picking up Jade City has pretty much resolved this desire to just break out of typical fantasy, because this hits different for so many reasons. Fonda Lee has written characters that, while they on surface level feel like they fall into typical cliches, each of them, all of them, are given depth and nuance that you're going to fall in love with. All right, let me go ahead and establish what exactly is going on here in Jade City before we get into the rest of this review. We have clan warfare going on, essentially mafia type fighting, in a modern-ish city, metropolitan area, and we follow the descendants of the people who have essentially built this situation that now exists, where there's two major clans that are on essentially a standoff and are so powerful they kind of have to have known peace treaties and stuff and work with the government, which, that's a real thing. Look at all kinds of mafias throughout history. They get powerful enough where eventually the government's like, all right, we're just gonna work with you. Now, the original generation of the people who made this are old, dying off, decrepit, and now we're looking at the youths who run the show, and we actually have three in particular who are our main characters for one of the clans. Hilo, Lan, and Shay, all of which outstanding characters. Hilo is more of the muscle for this clan, someone who, if this was written by a poorer writer, would just be another musclehead, overly aggressive guy. But Hilo is given so much depth and justification for his actions, as well as a very surprising amount of sensitivity that made him feel really different from almost anyone else I've come across who's been written in this type of position. Very much so enjoy his arc and who he is as a character. Then we have Lan, the one who's kind of been made the figurehead of this newer generation for the clan. He is running the show, so to speak, and calling the shots, while his grandfather, the one who built the mafia he's working for, kind of looks over his shoulder and is annoying, awful, bothersome. Then we have Shay, another one of this latest generation who doesn't necessarily want to be in the family business, and her arc of trying to constantly be roped in by the people around her and pushing against this desire to be involved, of course, feels very Godfather-esque, and it's executed so magnificently. This really is on the level of a Godfather Mafia story in a fantasy setting. I'm there for that, man. It's so good. Now, the original pillar or leader of this clan and the grandfather to these three characters, Call Sin, is someone else who is a real presence in the pages here. Someone who's older and showing the ramifications of working with Jade, falling into dementia a little bit as well with his age. He's just this relic from a time past, but that dynamic is not just looked down upon as some writers would do and just kind of treat the older generation like there's something outdated. There's a certain level of respect for what he accomplished and who he is, moments where he still is able to shine like the pillar he once was. But there are also definite, okay, here is respect to the new generation, how they're improving, learning from the situation they've been brought into. If I had to pick one favorite character, I probably couldn't. It would be a balance between Hilo and Shay. I enjoyed Lan as well, the other of the three children, but these two especially just really hit me as different and interesting. Shay's constant pull back and forth with her relationship in the clan was outstanding, and Hilo as this very human muscle character was just something I'm going to be going back and rereading or paying more attention to as I get further in this series for sure. So the real conflict driver here though for Jade City is the Jade itself, which powers a remarkably well-defined and understood hard magic system. This is a mineral that is mined, and if you have the proper bloodline and wear Jade, you are enhanced, though it's not that easy. There's also extreme amounts of training and discipline that go along with this. The 6 strengths are strength, steel, perception, deflection, lightness, and channeling, and each one has a really interesting aspect to it, and these kind of come together to be the overall enhancements of Jade, making you along the lines of a super soldier, but there are drawbacks to its usage. It definitely falls into the popular Brandon Sanderson rules for writing good magic system, but this doesn't just feel like another Brandon clone, and if you look into it, apparently Fonda Lee, the author of this story, who I now have I'm a fan. I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Apparently used to write sci-fi and wanted to treat her magic system as if it was scientific. And that kind of approach, I feel, gave Jade as a whole a very interesting angle as a magic system. And it just, again, hits different. I like the combination of the scrambling for the resource of this mineral of jade, these, powerful crime families trying to struggle with power, and the slow building. I don't want to get into spoilers here, but you are watching the beginnings of an avalanche throughout Jade City, and it's very clear as an outside reader in, but it's very understandable how the characters within the situation don't see the full picture like you, the reader, do. It's all justified and understood. If I had one slight criticism, there's a couple plot beats and things that happen where I felt like characters made choices just because they needed to make that choice for the plot to happen. It's really hard to avoid that feeling at points in storytelling, and I'm really nitpicking here if I'm going to get into that. But yeah, that's really the weakest thing I could say here. A couple characters did things where I went, that's a little bit out of character and maybe was just for the plot. But if that's the biggest problem I have, you're in gold standing. Let's talk about this world itself. It does feel fairly contained. We are in a metropolitan area, but it's so well defined that I wasn't really minding the fact that this is a fantasy story that's just really focusing on one city. It's definitely in the first book in the Gentleman Bastard sequence type vibe, where we have a city, but that city is pumped in with so much life and understanding that you're going to enjoy it as a whole. There's definitely the time taken to build up a culture and history for this world where you're going to feel immersed. It's unavoidable. I don't think you could read Jade City and not feel like you're walking these streets. I also want to say just the way Fonda Lee writes her world building as well feels very different than a lot of other writers. It's very distinct. It is very natural, and yet it feels like very much so Fonda Lee's style of world building, which isn't something I always get from new authors. There's quite a few people I know who world build and it just feels like generic fantasy world building, which is okay. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I do appreciate that the world building here felt very different. There's a cat nuzzling the phone currently. Sorry if you heard that. All of this now comes together to tell a story of betrayal, mystery, misunderstanding between the family, calculation. There's so little trust. Like, you will find yourself throughout this story being like, I don't know if who's right. It's complicated, and that's something when you're telling a crime story, I feel like you really have to be careful with and handle well, because obviously you're in a situation where there's going to be nefarious players, but you can't be heavy-handed or too subverting with what you're going for, because you'll either have people going, it's too obvious, or that came out of nowhere. Jade City walked right down that line for me, where I saw some things coming, but they were earned enough that I didn't mind, and there were definite surprises along the way as well. I can't believe I haven't said this yet. The clan we're following is called the No Peak Clan, and ironically named their main rival is the Mountain Clan. The relationship between these two feels like two characters in itself. That's how well this conflict is built in the story. You understand it on the street level all the way to the top. You understand the awkward piece that exists and how it becomes violated. And sorry if you consider that a spoiler, but come on, it's a crime book with two warring mafia. That's not a spoiler, come on. So many themes of family, loyalty, development, independence, none of which feel heavy-handed, except for when they kind of need to, so it just works. Like if you're gonna have a family crime syndicate, some family themes are gonna be rather overt, but they're not gonna feel out of place because that's what needs to be done here. But let's talk about this Mountain Clan, the rivals that are such a force within this narrative as well. They're helmed by a woman who you kind of expect when you hear about like a badass female antagonist, like, oh, she's gonna be very sexually written, or she's gonna have like the older woman like intimidation vibe. But when you meet her, this is a mild spoiler, but I just want to show it as an example of how well this book subverts a lot of what you're expecting while also still being realistic. She's a very normal woman. She's a very like, oh, this is like someone you could meet in the streets. And because of that, to me, she hit creepier than she would have if she was this over-sexualized thing or this older, like, individual. Having her be this, oh, I've killed so many. I've accomplished so much and formulated my own clan that rivals yours, and I'm just someone you could meet in the street. That hit well, man. I loved that. This is a story with high stakes that's not afraid to hurt, kill off, and really have ramifications to the characters as a whole. There's going to be those moments where you're going to be like, oh my god, no, as well as like fist pumping yes. And then the compliment of all compliment for how a writer is able to make me as a reader feel. Fonda Lee got me to feel both of those simultaneously, where characters make a decision where I'm going both yeah, badass, and no, don't, and talk about rare. Having someone who can make me feel so conflicted about a character's choices and invest in them so heavily. Beautiful. And the feelings of distrust here gave me anxiety at times, to the point where there's just like a neighbor to a character, and as soon as they're introduced, I'm like, nope. Don't like it. Another person, don't know what their loyalties are. Is they a plant? Are they real? Are they legit? I don't know. I don't know! If you look it up, Jade City has won several awards, and I agree with almost every single one it seems to have gotten. Big fan, can't wait to continue the series, and I'm gonna go ahead and rate this one a solid 9 out of 10. I get there's been some readers who didn't feel nearly as positive on this story as I did, but I'm a big fan, and hey, I'm not afraid to tell you that I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. And we're allowed to have a difference of opinion. But let me know what you thought of Jade City in the comments down below. I'm curious to see what people's take on this rather alternative fantasy story is going to be, because I'm going to be recommending this to quite a few people who aren't interested in the typical medieval fantasy setting. Especially if this whole series pans out as quality as this first book, I'll be recommending this to a ton of people in the future. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.